Alright, apologies for my pronunciation here. I don't speak Icelandic, but I'll give it a go. Outlandic either. Grýla comes to Seyðisfjörður. It was the night of the winter solstice, and it was 10 below zero. Outside the cottage, the winds were blowing sideways, whistling through the eaves and blowing snow and sleet into the window panes, which were shaking in their frames. Not a soul was about in the village of Seyðisfjörður, and Borgny Jomborsdóttir lived on its outskirts. Borgny had been drawn to the place by its annual Lunga art festival, where she'd given a talk on Icelandic folklore. She'd stayed behind after the festival to explore the nearby Fjarðarheiði mountain pass, and she'd quickly fallen in love with the area, especially after the tourists left and life in the village returned to normal. She'd been looking for a writing retreat, a place where she could live the simple life and focus on her books and her daughter, Paldis. Seyðisfjörður ticked all of the boxes. That night, as the weather worsened and the cold front pressed in from the Arctic, Borgny was finding it hard to focus on her work. Her Asus was running on battery on the dining room table, and she was pecking away at the keys like a sandpiper searching for insects. It had taken her 3 hours to write 500 words, in part because she had to keep stopping to flick through the reference books that were piled haphazardly on top of each other beside her laptop. She was working on a new book of folktales for children, which had the working title of Góða Nótt Borgningur. Borgny was proud to be one of the 10% of Icelanders who published a book, and Góða Nótt was to be her fourth. She'd already signed a contract with her publishers in Reykjavik and received a small but useful advance. It was just a shame that Paldis was so determined to stop her from working. Paldis Heiðriksdóttir was used to having her mother's undivided attention. She was the only child of a single mother, and with so few other distractions in Seyðisfjörður, Borgny usually hovered over her daughter like an Icelandic Coast Guard rescue copter. Paldis' father, Heiðrik Ingvaldsson, was no help to her or to anyone. He'd been killed in an explosion while Borgny had been in her second trimester. Heiðrik had wanted to provide for his family, and so had taken a job in construction, working on geothermal power stations. It had paid well, as had his life insurance. It had paid for the cottage in Seyðisfjörður. Paldis was a remarkably resourceful 5-year-old. She's also inherited her mother's intellect. After pestering her for attention and failing to get it, she changed tacks. Behaving herself wasn't working, so she tried misbehaving instead. She started unwrapping her Christmas presents early, tossing the paper and crinkled balls onto the tiled floor. That earned her a slap on the wrist, and Borgny stopped writing for long enough to take the presents away and to stash them out of reach at the top of her walk-in wardrobe. Then she pulled the cat's tail, and the cat delivered her comeuppance immediately by hissing at her and biting her little fingers. Paldis burst into tears, and Borgny didn't bother handing out a further punishment, though she did share a few choice words about how Paldis should treat others as she wanted to be treated. When Borgny turned back to her laptop, Paldis went through to her bedroom and unpacked her toy box, leaving stuffed animals and toy cars scattered all over the carpet. She wallowed in the mess for half an hour or so, even throwing a few of her toys against the wall, but her mother was glued to her laptop and seemed oblivious to the ruckus she was causing. Then Paldis dragged a stool over to the front door, climbed on top and unlocked it, before dragging the door open and letting herself out into the snow. Borgny was oblivious while that was going on, but it didn't take her long to feel the chill wind as it blew in through the doorway. She pushed herself back from her chair and stood up, then walked over to the door. She got there just as Paldis tried to come back in with a heap of dirty snow in her hands. "Paldis!" Borgny exclaimed. "What do you think you're doing?" "I'm building a snowman." "No, you're not," Borgny said. "What's gotten into you today?" "I was bored, Mama." "Me too, Paldis," Borgny replied. "Come on, let's get you into bed." "Will you tell me a story?" "Of course," Borgny said, taking her daughter by the hand and leading her into her bedroom. "We'll put on your Pokemon pyjamas first, okay? Let's just... oh..." Paldis' bedroom looked as though a volcano had erupted inside it, spewing toys and teddies all over the place. Borgny cursed to herself as she stepped on a piece of Lego. "What happened in here?" she asked. "I was bored, Mama," Paldis repeated. Borgny sighed. "Okay, we'll tidy this up tomorrow, okay?" Borgny said. "Right now it's time to get some sleep." "What about the story?" "What story would you like?" "Can you tell me the Viking story again?" Paldis asked, slipping a thumb into her mouth as Borgny picked her way across the floor towards the wardrobe. Borgny picked out the pyjamas and tossed them onto the bed. "Okay," Borgny said. "Put your pyjamas on first." "Yes, Mama." Paldis did as she'd been told, helped along by her mother, who was only half paying attention to the job in hand. She was thinking about the half-finished story on her laptop and trying to figure out how to make its bleak ending more palatable to younger readers. Once Paldis was in her pyjamas, Borgny helped her into bed and tucked her in. Then she sat at the end of the bed, opened up a book and began to read. "Once upon a time," she read, "about 1,000 years ago, there was a Viking called Egil Skallagrimsson. Unlike the other Vikings, Egil had more on his mind than sailing across the sea and pillaging and plundering his way along the coastlands. He was a farmer and a poet, as well as a fierce warrior. His wit was as sharp as his axe, and he was famous both at home and in the lands that he travelled through. She paused to turn over a page, glancing at her daughter as she did so. She had misgivings about telling the story again, but Egil's tale was Powdis' favourite, and Borgny had come across far worse during her research. Egil committed his first murder when he was 7 years old, Borgny continued. It was a different time. He also wrote his first skaldic poem at about the same age. That set the pattern that he followed throughout the rest of his life. Egil spent most of his time writing poems in praise of the lords and the kings that he admired, and when the poems weren't enough, he killed for them. You can still read many of his poems today. Borgny glanced across at her daughter, who had her eyes closed and her thumb once more in her mouth. One day, Norway's Erike Blood Axe declared that Egil was an outlaw, and so Egil decided it was time to leave Norway for good. But before he did so, he killed Erik's son, Rognvaldr, and placed a curse on the king and queen, who eventually fled themselves and ended their days in England, in the kingdom of Northumbria. Borgny stifled a yawn and turned another page. When Egil got older, he retired to his family farm here in Iceland, living until the ripe old age of 91. Just before his death, he buried his silver near Mossfellsberg. The legend goes that it's still there somewhere, hidden beneath the ground and waiting for someone to find it. Borgny closed the book and lifted herself up from the bed, intending to return to her laptop, but Powdis opened her eyes and looked up at her. "Thank you, Mama," Powdis said. "I like that story, but you missed the good bits." "Another time. Will you sing me a song?" Borgny smiled to herself and sat back down on the bed, glancing as she did so at the clock on the wall. She noticed that the curtain was open and made a mental note to close it before she herself went to bed. With the temperatures expected to drop even further during the night, she needed to do whatever she could to keep the heat in. Then she turned to Powdis and sang Bum Bum Bambalo.
Vini mínum vaka ég í ró, en úti bíður andlit á glugga. Þegar fjöllin fimbul há, fylla brjóst þitt heitri þrá. Leika skal ég langspil á, það mun þinn hugan hugga. Bíum, bíum, bambaló, bambaló, oj, diddli, diddli, dó. Vini mínum vaka ég í ró, en úti bíður andlit á glugga. Þegar veður geisa grimm, grúfir yfir hríðindin, kveiki ég á kertum þinn, burt flæmi skammdegi skugga. Bíum, bíum, bambaló, bambaló, oj, diddli, diddli, dó. Vini mínum vaka ég í ró, en úti bíður andlit á glugga. Ef þér sultur sverfur að, sauðakjöt ég hegg í spað, fljótt svo standi full með það, tunna hvert allur og dugga. Hvert sinn högnað smakka góðfiskinn, fram ég sendi flotan minn, skínandi skútur og gugga. Bíum, bíum, bambaló, bambaló, oj, diddli, diddli, dó. Vini mínum vaka ég í ró, en úti bíður andlit á glugga. Hjá mér bæði hlíf og skjól, hafa skalt ef illsku fól, flærðir með foldarból, læðast og launráð brugga. Bíum, bíum, bamba glugga.
As she sang the final verse, she glanced up and around the room, her mind wandering back to the Word document on her laptop. Her gaze paused at the window for a second and moved on, but then she felt a horrible jolt in her gut and turned to look at the window again. She'd seen a face there. Or had she? Borjni wasn't so sure, especially after she'd taken a second look at the frame and seen nothing but the snow outside gathering on the glass like a cold mould. When she finished the song, Powders had her eyes closed, but Borjni knew her daughter well enough to know that she wasn't asleep. "Wait there, baby. Mama will be back in just a minute." "Okay." Borjni climbed up from the bed and walked over to the window, then took a proper look outside. She could feel the cold through the glass, and it started to steam up from the warmth of her breath. Still, the lights were low enough in Powders' room that she could see outside, and there was nothing unusual out there. There was nothing at all, except for a narrow dirt path that had been snowed over, and a distant flicker of light that was either the Aurora or the industrial farm on the other side of town. She sighed and returned to her perch at the bottom of Powders' bed, then started singing Sofua Unga Astin Min.
Sofðu unga ástin mín, út í regnið grætur. Mamma geymir gullin þín, gamla legg og völu skrín. Við skulum ekki vaka dimmar nætur. Það margt sem myrkrið veit, minn hugur þungur. Oft ég svartan sandinn leit, svíða grænan engir í jöklinum hljóða dauða djúpar sprungur. Sofðu lengi, sofðu rótt, seint mun best að vakna. Mæðan kenna mun þér fljótt, meðan hallar degi skjótt. Að mennirnir elska, missa, grát og sakna.
This time she was barely halfway through when she saw the face at the window, and this time she was sure of it. It was ill-defined, especially with the condensation, and it was hard to be sure whether it belonged to a person or whether it was just pareidolia. It might just as easily have been a couple of knots in a tree. When she finished the song, she climbed back up and went over to the window. She had to wipe away the condensation on the sleeve of her shirt, and by the time that she looked outside, the face had disappeared again. But she had her suspicions. Borjni thought that Powders had fallen asleep, but there was only one way to be sure. And besides, she was still keeping an eye on the window. She sang Sofa Otu Bon.
Sofa urtu börn á útskerjum, vellur sjór yfir þau og enginn þau svæðir. Sofa kísubörn á kerlemum, þau murra og mala og enginn
By the time that she finished, Poldis was snoring with her thumb in her mouth and the face was back in the window. Borjni raced over, wiped the condensation from the glass and was confronted with the hellish visage of a nightmare fiend. The face had a boxer's pugnacious nose and a huge sagging jaw with two fangs protruding out above the jaw, curling upwards as though they were trying to pierce the jowled cheeks above them. The creature's teeth were black and rotting, a dentist's nightmare. It had two huge ears that were covered by its greasy black hair, and two heavy-set eyes that were yellowed and jaundiced. One of them was filmed over with a blind mist. Two gnarled horns rose out from its broad forehead. Borjni recognised the fiend immediately. It was Grýla the troll, the mother of the Yule lads and the eater of children. Grýla was nearly 8 feet tall and weighed more than a farmer's prize bull. She was dressed in an outfit made from hemp sacks and covered in a thick layer of snow that made her look like a festive sculpture from a child with a sick imagination. When Borjni made eye contact with her, Grýla leered back at her and then took off to her right, out of view of the window. "Anskotin," Borjni said. She'd read about Grýla, of course she had, when she'd been working on a second book, and she'd been raised on tales of the evil troll and her mischievous offspring, who came every Christmas. That meant that she knew exactly what to do, but it was a race against time. She started by dragging the curtains across the window, though she knew it wouldn't do any good. Then she rushed to the kitchen and opened the cupboard beneath the sink before rifling through the junk that she kept there because there was nowhere else to put it. It took her longer than she would have liked to find what she was looking for, but she eventually pulled out 5 black candles and a box of matches. There were no holders for the candles, but they had a pillar design and would stand up by themselves. She just hoped that the matches were dry. There was a heavy knock at the front door, sounding more like a gunshot than the impact of a hand against wood. Even if she hadn't seen the troll, the knock would have been disconcerting by itself, especially because she had few visitors and a functioning doorbell. The knock came again, and then a third time. It was slow, but it was also insistent, and it didn't stop. Her hands shaking, Borjni slid open the box of matches and withdrew one, then struck it against the touch paper. It flickered into life for the briefest of moments and then sputtered back out again. "Faru tilunskotans." She lit another match, and that one stayed alight for a couple of seconds, which was long enough for her to light the first wick. Then she tossed the matches to one side and used the first candle to light the other 4. As soon as the 5th one caught light, the knocking stopped. For a couple of seconds, Borjni hardly dared to breathe. She counted to 10 beneath her breath. "Null," she murmured. "Ein, twee, drei, fjordir, fim, seks, sjo, atta, nu, tiu." She breathed a sigh of relief and walked back through to Poldis's room to check on her. She was still asleep, still snoring, still sucking her thumb. Then there was a boom and a howl of wind, which shrieked through the house and brought the cold with it. Borjni whirled around just in time to see Grýla crouching to enter through the doorway. The door itself had almost been ripped from its hinges, and it had taken a chunk out of the plasterboard as the handle bashed against it. Grýla was huge, ugly, and terrifying. She was also carrying a burlap sack. "Boo," she said. Her voice had a rasp and a lisp to it, and sounded like a boulder rolling down a mountainside. Borjni backed away instinctively, then realised it was taking her into Poldis's room, which lit the flames of bravery within her. She took a hesitant step forward. "Grýla," she replied, "I thought the candles would have stopped you." "That's old magic," Grýla said dismissively, waving a huge gnarled hand and dislodging a framed photo from the wall. "What do you want from me, Grýla?" "I want your child." "You can't have her." "I must have her," Grýla said. "Lapalo is hungry, and I'm going to take your child back to my cave in the Dimmu ice fields and make a stew for my husband, my sons, and the Yule cat." "If the old magic doesn't work," Borjni murmured, "what about the new magic?" "What was that?" "Nothing," Borjni replied. "Follow me, I'll take you to Poldis." But she didn't take Grýla to Poldis, leading her instead into the well-lit and well-stocked kitchen. She walked over to the fridge and opened the door, then started withdrawing everything that a hungry troll might need. She gave Grýla cold meats and blocks of cheese, including a huge wheel of gudastur and a healthy amount of skyr. She also gave her some bread and some pannukakkur that were left over from that morning's breakfast. Grýla accepted the food greedily with an expression of delight upon her craggy and age-worn face. She started rifling through the goodies there and then, and Borjni seized upon that to pick up a broom that had been leaning against the wall in the corner, and used it like a lance to charge at the troll. "Take your food and get out of here," Borjni commanded, jabbing with the broom to push Grýla back towards the door and outside again. Grýla grinned mischievously at her, but she allowed herself to be shepherded outside. Borzny knew that if she'd wanted to, she could have snatched the broom from her hands and snapped it in two like a toothpick, but she also knew that Grýla had got what she'd come for. "You'll hear from me again," Grýla said. Then she turned her back and walked away into the night, her massive feet crunching the snow as her tree-trunk legs worked like pistons. Borzny heaved a sigh of relief. Her first thought was to call the police, but she quickly dismissed that idea. What could she possibly say to them? And what did she expect as an outcome? If she told them the truth, she'd be carted off to an asylum and her daughter would be placed into foster care. And so she did the only thing that she could do. She closed the front door, testing it as she did so to make sure that its hinges had held, then shot the bolts across and put the chain on. She looked at it for a few moments and then dragged an armchair through from the living room for good measure. She pushed it up against the door and then made a few more trips to weigh it down with sacks of flour, dumbbells from her home gym, and armfuls of books from the living room shelves. When she was finished, she turned around and almost leapt out of her skin. Poldis was awake, and she was standing behind her mother in her pyjamas and staring sleepily up at her. "Jesus, Poldis, you scared me." "I'm sorry, Mama." "Come on," Borzny said, "let's get you back to bed." "Can I have another story?" "I think we've had enough stories for one night," Borzny said, leading her back through to her bedroom by the arm. She lifted her up and dropped her onto the bed, then pulled back the blanket and tucked her in. "Now, go to sleep, Poldis. Be a good girl or I'll give you to Grýla." Poldis shuddered and said nothing. Borzny kissed her on the top of the head and swept her hair from her eyes, then headed back out to the kitchen, turning the lights off and closing the door behind her. She poured herself a shot of whiskey and downed it, savouring the fire as it worked its way down her esophagus. Then she poured and drank another one. It had been a long day, and she never had finished the story she'd been working on. That night, as she drifted in and out of sleep, she had fever dreams of faces at windows and old superstitions. She woke up sweating, took another long slug of whiskey from the bottle that she'd left on her bedside table, then dropped off again. She woke one final time when the clock in the living room chimed 4 a.m. She fluffed up her pillow and rolled over, pushing her face into the cool fabric and pressing her eyes together. Then they shot open. She'd heard something. She was sure she had.